Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vogt, the host and the content director here at Word on Fire Catholic Ministries. We're getting near the Christmas season. We're right here in the middle of Advent, and I'm joined by Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, good to see you.
Hey, Brandon. Always a great pleasure to be on with you.
Now, I mentioned at the last episode that you had just returned from this big gathering of U.S. Catholic bishops in Baltimore. We didn't get a chance to talk about that, so maybe give us an update. How'd that go for you?
It's good. You know, they're important meetings. We cover a lot of ground. In recent years, of course, the sex abuse scandals have always been, at the center of our preoccupation, how to deal with that institutionally. This year, I had the opportunity to address all the bishops on this famous issue that you and I have talked about many, many times of the unaffiliated, the young people, especially leaving the church. So that to me was kind of a highlight. And the fact that so many bishops responded to that presentation. Of course, you were part of it too. I took a lot of, encouragement from that. What I like best about those meetings is the chance just to get together with the brothers, so we bishops do meet together quite frequently. And I think that's good for us and good for the church. Anyway, for me, it was the end of a very long period of obligations and speeches and trips. This fall was exceptionally busy, and that was kind of the last stop. So I was kind of happy to come home and unwind a little bit.
Well, at the previous bishops' meeting, you gave an overview of what your committee on evangelization and catechesis had accomplished. And it was supposed to be sort of a very short presentation, 10, 15 minutes. But then during the Q&A session, all the bishops were lining up and asking question after question and affirming and celebrating and encouraging. And pretty soon it turned into like an hour plus long thing. We saw the same dynamic at this most recent November meeting. You gave a 15-minute presentation, showed a short little video clip, and then there was a panel discussion. And once again, it went way over time. There was so much interest and energy among the bishops on this topic, which was encouraging to see. So I thought for this podcast episode, we'd walk through your presentation. Again, this was directed just at the bishops. And you were describing 5 ways to draw nuns or young people in general back to the church. And again, you were directing this at the bishops themselves. What should the bishops be doing in their own dioceses? Let's jump in. Suggestion number 1, get young people involved in the works of justice. I guess, first of all, why'd you choose to lead with this suggestion? You have a bunch of them, and we'll cover some here that'll be familiar to listeners, but this isn't one you typically lead with. Why'd you decide to lead with it here?
Well, because in so many of the surveys, it's clear that young people get the church's commitment to social justice. They don't get our sexual teaching, and that's, of course, a topic for another day. I mean, why that's true and what we should do about it. But it's very clear they like the church's commitment to the poor and the homeless and the hungry. They like Catholic relief services. They like Catholic charities. They get that. To me, it's a no-brainer in a way, because start with the thing that people readily find most attractive about Catholicism. And there are 1,000 reasons why at this point in our cultural history, people find the works of justice so appealing. It's not always been true. I mean, go in other parts of our history, and other aspects of the church's life would be probably more appealing. For 100 different reasons, this one now is. Okay, take advantage of it. In other words, I would recommend not leading with the things that young people find most off-putting about us, but let's lead anyway with the things they find most readily attractive. A point I made with the bishops, and I made it explicitly in reference to the sexual teaching. I'm not saying by any means, let's jettison that. Forget about our sexual teaching. Who needs it? No. I'm with Reynold Hillenbrand, who was my predecessor at Mundelein Seminary as rector way back in the 1940s. There's a tight link, in fact, between the church's call to justice and the church's sexual teaching. So we'll get there. So this is a marathon, not a sprint, right? When it comes to evangelization, how do you draw people in? But I'd say maybe the first part of that marathon, start with justice, because they get it readily. And I think they'll respond more favorably.
One of the things you encourage your brother bishops to do in their dioceses is not just to get young people involved in the actual works of the corporal works of mercy, but to also lift up social-minded saints. And you mentioned a few of these. Who are some of the saints that you think best embody this tradition?
The great thing, Brandon, as you well know, is they run right through our great tradition. So this goes back to the Hebrew prophets. Go to Ezekiel and Daniel and Isaiah and Amos and Hosea. I mean, the great Hebrew prophets. That's where this whole thing comes from. It comes roaring up, of course, into Jesus himself, who readily accepts the title of prophet and speaks those same truths. Then church fathers, have people read Ambrose, have them read John Chrysostom. You'll find very strong things about care for the poor and justice and so on. Thomas Aquinas, my hero, says something which I think still takes the breath away of a lot of people today, which is, yes, we have a right to private ownership of property, but when it comes to the use, Thomas says, of your private property, the primary consideration should always be the common good. Wow. I mean, most people today, it seems to me, like in the capitalist West, wouldn't readily think that way. They say, no, it's my property. I should use it, for first to my advantage. And then if I have some left over. But Thomas says, no, in the use of it, it's the common good that should be your first consideration. Now come up from Thomas all the way to the social magisterium of the popes, from Leo XIII all the way through Francis. I'd hold up those people, as well as someone you talked about in your own writings, Dorothy Day, the 20th century. One of the great prophets, you might say, of social justice. And mind you, Dorothy Day, the link between social justice and prayer and the Mass and the Eucharist and the saints, the mystical life, she was not a one-sided, hey, everything's social justice. It was on the contrary. So I think all those people can and should be lifted up. We've got this tradition. Let's use it.
What would you say to the objection? And I think one of the bishops raised this during the Q&A period that, hey, I'm all for involving young people in, serving in soup lines, helping the homeless and the sick, but that won't in and of itself introduce them to Jesus Christ. What do you say to that objection?
Well, true enough, but it's not the omega, it's the alpha. You might say it's the first step. It's a opening of a door. I've always said justice in itself is evangelically ambiguous, because anyone of goodwill, even an atheist of goodwill, can be attracted to the works of justice. Buddhists and Hindus and Muslims and Protestants and everyone else can be attracted to justice. So, right, in itself, it's not. Well, I guess I'd urge this, Brandon. It's the insight from the very early church. How these Christians love one another. So what is evangelically compelling is when people watch the activity of Christians for the sake of the poor and working for justice. That becomes attractive. And that is evangelically quite relevant. So it's the beginning, not the end. It's the first step, not the last step.
Wasn't that, you would know better than me, in the early church, that was one of the most striking signs of the Christian community, was how they loved not just each other, but the people on the margins.
Right, because things that we would say, of course, are morally outrageous. Like if a child is born, the child has some, deformity, that he was left out on the hillside. He was just exposed to the elements. Well, in the ancient world, that wasn't considered a bad thing to do. That was the right thing to do. And when Christians came along and said, no, that's not right, and we're going to, in fact, rescue these children, that was a very arresting move. In the ancient world, that got the attention of ancient society. And then they began to wonder, okay, who are these people and why are they acting this way? And that's, of course, an evangelically compelling move.
All right, we're talking about 5 ways to draw young people back to God. That was way number 1, get young people involved in the works of justice. Way number 2 is to use the via pulchritudinis, the way of beauty. Why did you tell the bishops that beauty is perhaps a more effective route of access today than goodness or justice?
Yeah, I've just said, of course, that justice does have a alluring quality, which it does. But I've also argued, and I think there's something to this, that of the 3 transcendentals, I mean, they're the true, the good, and the beautiful in a way is the least threatening. So even if you say, hey, look, here's the work of justice, and you ought to do this, some people might say, well, I mean, come on, who are you to tell me what I should be doing? And if you say, look, here's the truth of the matter, you should believe it, a lot of people would get reactive to that. But the beautiful is just something you look at, right? It's less threatening. Just look at it. Look at this beautiful thing. Whether it's a work of art, it's a poem, it's literature, It's an icon. It's the liturgy itself. Sometimes, just drawing someone into a beautiful church, you're not telling them what to think or how to behave. You're just showing them, or bringing someone to Mass if that Mass is really beautiful, and that can lead them then on the path. They can say, well, where did this come from? What world produced something like Notre Dame Cathedral? That didn't come out of a vacuum. That came out of a rich culture. Well, what is that culture? Who are these people? What do they believe and why? So the beautiful can lead you in. The example, Brandon, I've often used is Charles Ryder, from Brideshead Revisited, the great Evelyn Waugh novel. Ryder's an agnostic, like a lot of people today, kind of a cool rationalist. And he's first intrigued by the beauty of this great manor house, Brideshead, which was the home of this Catholic family. By the end of the novel, spoiler alert, I suppose if anyone wants to read Brideshead Revisited, by the end of the novel, Charles accepts Catholic doctrine, but it's a long, long journey. It commenced with the beauty of Brideshead, which symbolizes the beauty of the church. And then he, by a long process, began to explore, where did that come from? And he comes eventually to faith. So that's my model there of the via pulchritudinis, which, by the way, is Pope Francis's language.
One thing I liked when you were speaking to the bishops is you said, we need beautiful buildings and beautiful churches. Of course, we need beautiful music. But this sang to my heart, especially through Word on Fire. You said, when we're trying to reach the unaffiliated, we also need to have beautiful websites, beautiful videos. You're speaking to bishops who run parishes and dioceses. What does your diocesan website look like? What are the videos you're putting out? Because for many young people, that's the first impression they're going to have of the church in your area.
Like it or not, that's the portal for an awful lot of young people. Let's say they've got a question, or they're, for whatever reason, intrigued, or they're angry, or whatever it is. What's anyone under the age of 40 or 45 now going to do? They're going to go to a website. What does the Catholic Church say about this? Well, what's your website like when they go to it? Is it just, text? Is it some unimaginative layout? You know better than I. I mean, your generation, what makes a website compelling to people? And so I told them, that's not a trivial matter. How much money and time are you putting into your website? Are you putting some of your best and brightest people on the website? Because that's where they come. They're far more likely to come to a website than to just wander into your church building. They might, and that's great. So the church building should be beautiful. But the website, you bet.
Whenever I'm speaking to priests or consulting with bishops, I just pose this theoretical question. How much do you spend on landscaping around your church buildings versus how much do you spend on graphic design, video, your website?
Absolutely.
Not saying they have to be equal, but as you say, far more people are going to discover you online than offline.
Super important. And you're right about the investment thing. Years ago, a spiritual director of mine said, a very important point of spiritual discernment at the end of each month is look at your Visa bill, because it'll tell you a lot about what are you spending your money on. And I've never forgotten that. And whenever I get my Visa bill, my credit card bill, and I look at, okay, what was I spending money on? Because that will tell you what you're prioritizing. So for a parish, look at your budget. What are you spending money on? What if we ask that budgetary question with this issue of the nuns in mind all the time? How are we investing in this problem of finding the unaffiliated?
I raised that point during the panel discussion, that you've shifted your language. We used to say, you and I, a couple of years ago, this is the number one most pressing issue for the church today. But now we've acknowledged, okay, the abuse crisis probably has taken the first slot, but this is right on its heels. But when you look at most dioceses and parishes, they've invested a lot of time and a lot of money into that number one problem. They have full-time staff members dedicated to safe environment training, victim reporting, counseling, all sorts of stuff. But the question of how much have we invested for that number two problem, I think, is still outstanding. Are we hiring people whose full-time job it is to focus on bringing back the nuns?
Right. And if we're just focused on buildings and programs and infrastructure, I mean, fine, I get it, totally get it. But You need people to inhabit these buildings and to use the infrastructure. So if we're not going after the people, what's the point of shoring up the infrastructure?
All right, let's move on. So we're talking about 5 ways to draw young people back to God. Number 1 was get people involved in the works of justice. Number 2 was to use the via pulchritudinis, the way of beauty. 3, which will be no surprise to listeners here, stop dumbing down the faith. You've long said that the de-emphasis on the intellectual has been a pastoral disaster. Why is that?
Whenever I can, and I'm always reluctant, as you suggest here, Brandon, to bring it up because I sound like a broken record. I've been saying this for so long, and I told the bishops that. I said, I know you've heard this from me a million times, but that's the way it goes. Repetitio mater studiorum, the Romans said. Repetition is the mother of studies. I mean, so if you want a point to get across, you've got to repeat it. And I use that phrase a lot on purpose. That the dumbing down of the faith has been a pastoral disaster because, gosh, we drive a wedge, stupidly in my judgment, between the intellectual and the pastoral. And that is deadly because, in fact, this de-emphasis on the intellectual has redounded very negatively in our pastoral work. The church fathers, they weren't academics in our sense. They were pastors. I mean, the greatest thinkers for the first 5 centuries of the church's life were all pastors for the most part, bishops, but we call them today probably pastors of big parishes. So it has indeed been a pastoral disaster that we've dumbed it down. And you don't need to take my word for it. Every single study shows it, that young people saying, I got all these questions are never answered. What about this? What about that? Science disproves religion. All these, frankly, often elementary questions. And I don't mean that to be condescending or to denigrate those who ask them, but these are questions that could have been cleared up on day 1 of a good, let's say, high school religion class. The fact that so many young people have them says to me we have not been addressing these questions with anything approaching adequacy.
Now, you affirm that you've been banging this drum for a while about not dumbing down the faith, but it's easy to say that in the abstract. What would you specifically like to see, say, a bishop in a diocese do to raise the intellectual bar?
Take a good hard look at the educational programs. Look at the textbooks being used. How are teachers and catechists being trained? Don't assume everything is fine, because I think the studies show that everything is not fine. And that bishops who are the chief teachers and catechists and theologians of their diocese should make that a top priority. Bring in your education people and say, okay, what are we using? What are our texts? How are they working? If not, why not? And let's get better ones. And are our teachers adequately trained? Like, I think, Brandon, you and I know this, that so many young people have a range of fairly predictable, call them apologetic type questions. Questions about God, about the church, about Jesus, about eternal life, about morality, etc., right? How well trained are our confirmation formators, our high school teachers in addressing those questions? I think it'd be a wonderful thing for a diocese to do is to get all their people together. How about for a year-long process or a couple of years long process like a synod, but to train them in dealing with these great questions that young people have. So those are a few ideas I'd have. I'd make it a top priority.
I've always dreamed of coming up with a list of things that no child would be able to graduate from a Catholic high school or a religious education program still believing. For example, that faith and science are in conflict. That there are no good arguments or evidence for God. Go down the list. And that's the metric by which we'll determine whether we're succeeding or failing in our catechesis.
Yeah, I agree. Let's have some standards in place that wouldn't be that complicated in a way. And can all of our teachers in our various programs and catechists, how do they do with all these questions? Can they handle them persuasively? I agree that it's not just a classroom and all that. I think it's wonderful that you bring in the prayer dimension and the liturgy and that the classroom should not just be like this, rigorous academic setting. And I agree with all that, all of it. But these great issues remain that have to be addressed.
All right, let's move on to number 4. This is the 4th way to draw young people or nuns back to the church. You recommend that every parish be turned into a missionary society. What do you mean by that?
Here I'm following Pope Francis again, when he said in that famous, I think it was a sermon some years ago, is the churches, we have to get out of the sacristies. And I think, unfortunately, he was read there as somehow anti-liturgical. I don't think that's at all what he meant. He just meant by sacristy, he was using a kind of a symbolic term to say we need to send our people out from the liturgy, out from our own parochial life to evangelize. But do we think, Brandon, of our Catholic parishes that way? And I've been a Catholic now all my life and have been in and around parishes for my whole life. I don't think we have that typically in our imagination. We think of parishes as places Catholics come to go to Mass, above all, obviously centrally important, to receive the sacraments, for kids to get some basic instruction to prepare them for sacraments. Maybe there'll be a handful of people, and you and I know this, most parishes, a handful of people that come to specialized classes or programs in Bible or in spirituality. And again, I'm not saying one negative thing about any of that. I'm in favor of all of it. But I wonder how many of our parishes have this idea that now our ultimate purpose is to take all these people who've come for these various things and train them in discipleship and send them on mission. We've got this extraordinary infrastructure in place. Think of all the Catholic parishes. What is the number? Like 20,000 or something around our country. But if you were a military commander and you said, boy, I got 20,000 outposts, 20,000 camps or forts, whatever you want to call them, from which I can launch, Well, we've got that infrastructure, 20,000 centers of Catholicism. But do most of our people say, look, I've come to Mass. I mean, that's pretty good. Most Catholics don't. I've received the sacraments, good, and now I get on with my life. No, now you're being formed as a missionary. That's the whole purpose, is to go out and draw people back. But that's a change of consciousness that's really difficult, but needed.
In this regard of turning churches into missionary hubs, you've often referenced Rick Warren, the popular author of The Purpose-Driven Life. He's the pastor of Saddleback Church, kind of a non-denominational church there in California. How does he do this in his community? Yeah,
I don't think with the bishops, I think I forgot to reference this with him, but I have elsewhere. I met him. It's a couple years ago. He's near me, meaning he's about 4 hours away from where I live. But I met him at his church. An extraordinary fellow, as you say, well-known, maybe the leading figure in the sort of mega church movement. And what he said to me, and I haven't forgotten it, is what people know about him is he's kind of a friendly guy, wears the Hawaiian shirt. Don't call me reverend or pastor, call me Rick. Everything's very relaxed and friendly and inviting. And he said, right, because that's my first move, is to get people in, to draw them to the church. But he said, I don't stop there. People think that's all I do. I'm just the friendly guy in the Hawaiian shirt, No, once they're in, then the demands are made, namely discipleship and mission. In other words, you're part of this church? Okay. Then you got to walk with me through courses and prayer and everything else to become a disciple of Jesus. All right? You're still with us? Now I'm sending you on mission. And Rick Warren said to me, if they don't do those things, they're out. I mean, they're off the rolls of the church. In other words, he's not just saying, hey, you're coming to service. Terrific. No, you're coming to service. Step one. Now let's really get serious about discipleship and mission. I don't think, Brandon, we Catholics have that mentality, and we should.
All right, let's look at the fifth and final way to draw young people back to the church. We've talked about getting them involved in the works of justice, the way of beauty, stop dumbing down the faith, turning every parish into a missionary society. The fifth way you recommended is to creatively use the new media. Say more about that.
Well, you should probably talk about it. It's in your blood in a way. It's not in mine. But I told the bishops this, that when I was in Rome a year ago for the youth synod, I made this argument. I said, look, we have a crisis of disaffiliation of the young, but at the same time, through God's providence, we have a tool now that we didn't have even 10 years ago. a tool by which we can actually reach those who have disaffiliated. So in the past, people wandered away. Well, what can we do? Well, let's try to make the mass as attractive as possible. Let's have programs in our parishes that might draw them back. Well, I mean, I think you and I both know that's not going to be super effective. But now, through the social media, listen, with all their limitations, and you and I know better than probably anybody how limited and problematic they can be. But having said that, they give us a means of reaching into the world of the disaffiliated and to bring a sort of winsome and compelling message from the church. I've got, it's up in my room across the hall here, a print of Van Gogh's famous Sower painting, which I've always loved. And I love it not just because it's a great picture, but because it speaks of what I try to do, which is to sow the seed of the word, you know. Gosh, what the social media give us in terms of enhanced capacity to sow the seed of the word. And you and I see it all the time, don't we? People that they come across our work in sometimes the most surprising ways. Great. Let's use the new media now as creatively and energetically and intelligently as we can, because God's given us a tool precisely at the moment when we most need it.
One thing that we've recognized here at Word on Fire is there's kind of two dimensions of creatively using the new media. One is to proclaim stuff by broadcasting videos and websites and social media posts and all that. But then there's another powerful route of dialogue. I'm thinking here specifically about your Reddit AMAs, your engaging people like Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro and all this stuff, where you can use the new media to directly dialogue with people who have left the church, people that would never show up to our institutions, never darken the doors. And that's something that, I mean, you don't need special gifts to put yourself out there and do it. Any bishop, any priest, any church leader can make themselves available online, right?
Yeah, and I've urged that. And, you know, as you were talking, Brandon, I was just thinking, you know, of the negativity of that, which anyone that's involved with social media understands. When you open a comm box, when there's the opportunity for people to comment on what you've done, you are going to get an awful lot of blowback and silliness and obscenity and so on. But whenever that happens, and look, I find it discouraging, as anybody would, right? But at the same time, I think, okay, compared to what the great evangelists of our tradition faced, like bows and arrows and bullets and beheadings
or
and
Isaac Jogues, like getting his tongue ripped out or whatever.
Right. It's not as bad as that. You know? And so I think I can handle a few negative comments on comm boxes. But, you know, okay, that's the way it's always been from the Areopagus on, is that when you proclaim Christianity, and actually Paul, as I've said before, and the Areopagus is good because as he announces the resurrection, what happens? Well, people laugh. So that's the ancient version of someone in a comm box mocking you, right? Or they just walk away. Well, so it's always been. So welcome to the club. You know, you're standing in a great tradition, going all the way back to St. Paul and coming up through the great missionary martyrs when you publicly announce the faith, and you get a lot of blowback, but some listen. And there's that again from Acts 17, Dionysius and a few others listen. We'll hear you again on this. And there are the seeds of the European Christianity, which would eventually spread all over the world. Never underestimate what you can accomplish through these means, even as you face, because I mean, that's the devil's always involved and always wants to be a source of discouragement. Okay, just take it for granted. But as you sow the seeds, you know, some fall on rocky soil, some are going to fall on the path and the birds eat them up. Okay, so it goes. Some will mock you for sowing seed. What an idiot. How could you be sowing those goofy seeds? Okay, just keep sowing the seeds. And I think the social media give us a great way to do that.
Well, that sound means it is time now for our listener question. If you have a question that you'd like to ask Bishop Barron, we'd love to hear it. Just send it in at askbishopbarron.com. Today we have one from a young lady in Texas named Miriam. Her biology teacher is suggesting that she read some popular atheist authors, and she's wondering how to respond and what to do. So here's Miriam's question.
Hi, Bishop. My name is Miriam from Texas. My biology professor is an atheist who loves to challenge my faith. He is very manipulative, and sometimes I feel unprepared to stand up for it. He specifically told me to listen to Russell and Hitchens, and I want to be able to refute this philosophy with St. Thomas Aquinas. I just don't know where to begin. What books do you suggest for me as a beginner seeking Aquinas apologetics? Thanks so much. I learned so much from you.
That's great. Thank you for that question. And, it sort of annoys me a little bit to hear that story because it's very unfair in a way of that teacher. If he's fair-minded, maybe he would even recommend, here are some people that stand against, Hitchens and Russell, and maybe have you read both of them. But anyway, here's the first observation. Bertrand Russell was one of the great thinkers of the 20th century, co-wrote the Principia Mathematica. When it comes to symbolic logic, read Bertrand Russell. Frankly, when it comes to religion, he's terrible. And what I mean there is he has a terrible grasp of what serious religious people mean. Same with Christopher Hitchens, a writer whom I admired, on politics and culture and literature. Great. Read Christopher Hitchens. On religion, he was terrible. On religion, he betrayed a deep misunderstanding of most basic, Christian ideas. Now, for refutation, there's been a lot. The good news is there have been a lot of books and videos and podcasts and so on responding to this new atheism. Maybe a couple things I'd mention. You might want to start with the internet. I've done a lot of things on new atheism and responding to their criticisms and talking about arguments for God's existence. Or I think, Brandon, your website, right, Strange Notions, that looks into a lot of these arguments and gives counter arguments. Don't you have famously like 20 arguments for God's existence that are kind of
if you go to strangenotions.com, the first thing you'll see is a link that says 20 arguments for God's existence. Yeah. And it's by Dr. Peter Kraft. He sort of synthesizes the 5 Thomistic arguments, but then 15 others there.
Yeah, so look at that website, but also read Kraft himself, who has written extensively on all of this. Some go-to people for me, when I was a young man, I read F.C. Copleston, the great Jesuit historian of philosophy. He has a little paperback book on Aquinas that might be helpful. We mentioned before a friend out here, Dr. Ed Fazer, who writes extensively and very well on Aquinas, his philosophy, the arguments for God's existence. Now, we're getting a little technical with his books. But I would take a look maybe at some of the internet business, the internet stuff. Here's another one. Go on YouTube and look up the Hitchens, William Lane Craig debates. So Hitchens, as you know now, the great atheist, but he was debated several times by William Lane Craig, who's an evangelical Christian apologist, who did, I think, mop the floor with Hitchens every time he debated him. So maybe watch those and listen to Craig's engagement of Hitchens. I had a couple ideas, but don't get bullied by your teacher.
Just to add to those recommendations, pick up Craig's book titled On Guard, which was written for high school and college students, teaching them how to respond to atheist arguments. And then from a Catholic perspective, Trent Horn's book titled Answering Atheism, I think it's the best Catholic book on the topic. So you have a slew of homework to do, Miriam, but don't let your teacher bully you and suggest that these guys have the last word, because they certainly don't.
They're very bad on religion. They don't really understand serious religion.
Well, thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Word on Fire show. Couple of quick requests. One, if you have not reviewed this show yet, please do. It takes just a couple seconds, takes no money from you. It's easy to do. Just go on iTunes, search for Word on Fire show, leave a short review. The more review the shows have, the more often it recommends it to others. So it's a huge help to us. We'd really appreciate it. Second, if you'd like to support this show financially and help us take it to the next level, we're planning a big reboot of the studio spaces, the lighting, the cameras, all the equipment for early 2020, but we need your help to make that happen. So to support the show, go to wordonfireshow.com/patron, become one of our monthly patrons, and join us in this great journey of evangelizing through the world of podcasting. Well, thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.